Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today at the J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. I'm Francis Torres, Senior Policy Analyst for Housing here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Today, we'll be addressing the topic of housing affordability for military service members and their families, with a particular focus on the issues that households face when seeking out housing in the civilian housing markets near the bases where they're stationed. As many of our viewers here might know, the Department of Defense relies on local communities for housing, with approximately 60% of service members stationed in the US living off base. However, military personnel and their families are finding housing costs and relocation issues increasingly expensive, stressful, and burdensome. Recent surveys reveal housing affordability and increasing rental costs are top concerns for off-base military households. Here at the Terwilliger Center, we're interested in understanding how growing concerns regarding affordability near military bases tie in to the broader crisis of affordable housing across the country. And to that end, we've recently published a blog answering some frequently asked questions about housing for military families, which you can access by going to our website, bipartisanpolicy.org, as well as via a link that will be dropped in our chat shortly. In this event, we will dive deeper into the topic with a panel of advocates and researchers who will discuss the causes and repercussions of high housing costs on military families and highlight proposals to ensure that these families have access to decent, safe, and affordable homes. So we're very lucky to have with us today Dr. Jessica Strong, Senior Director of Applied Research at Blue Star Families, John Hughes, Senior Vice President for Government and Industry Relations at USIA, and Shannon Razadin, President and Executive Director of the Military Family Advisory Network. Thank you all so much for joining us. Before I get into the questions for our panel, if you're watching this live, please do submit any questions you have at any time. You can post them in the chat if you're watching on YouTube, or you can tweet them to @BPC_bipartisan or using the hashtag BPCLive. So without further ado, and to kick off the conversation, I would love for our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, talk about how they've been engaging with this topic of housing affordability in off-base communities, and talk a little bit about the work that your organizations are doing to address the issue. So we can kick it off with Dr. Strong. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here today and join some of our other colleagues, Shannon and John. So nice to see you guys again. And thank you for inviting us, Francis. So Blue Star Families has been tracking the issue of housing and relocation challenges and affordability for a few years now. We continue to keep tabs on it through our Military Family Lifestyle Survey. We just published our results from the 2022 survey a couple of days ago, where we have a finding on housing relocation. I'm happy to share some of that with you all today. We also have recently done a pulse check, which is a topical survey just on this issue back in September of last year, sort of at the end of PCS season in 2022. And I can share some of the results from that as well. But we've seen, as many of my colleagues here have seen, and as many others in the military and veteran serving organization space have seen, that increasing housing costs and increasing out-of-pocket relocation costs are really top of mind for military families. So I'm excited to share and talk more about this issue with the rest of you all today. I'm going to pass it over to Shannon.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jessica. And thank you so much for having this conversation here today. I think it's really important that we put a spotlight on the challenges that military families are facing. And thank you for bringing the three of us together. So a little bit about myself, about MFAN. We are a 10-year-old nonprofit. And what we do is we work to understand the lived experiences of military families and catalyze change. And so to do that, like Blue Star Families, we conduct regular research. We have a survey that we launch every other year, and then we do topical research in our off years. We also have an advisory board, which is a group of currently serving and also veteran spouses who really give us a constant ear to the ground and understanding of what military families are going through. So often we hear things through them, and then we test it through research to learn if it's an anecdote or if it's something that we really need to dive deeper into as an organization. From the perspective of housing, we really see that there is a thread that impacts a variety of different areas of military life that's related to housing and access to housing and affordability and the experience of frequent moves. And so as an organization, like with Blue Star, this has been a perennial issue that we've looked at in our research and our surveys. We also convene a military housing roundtable that brings together leaders in the space and people with a vested interest in housing and understanding the experience and working together to share information so that none of what we do exists in a vacuum. They're sharing best practices and making sure that we're never reinventing the wheel, but more so collaborating together as a community. And then the last piece is, as we've done work in the area of food insecurity, for example, we see a real connection that we'll talk about in a little bit between food insecurity and housing. And so we've made sure that we're getting people information about housing resources when they're coming to us for food related support.
Thanks so much, Shannon. And then we'll pass it over to John.
Thanks so much, Francis. So John Hughes with USAA. USAA was founded in 1922 by 25 Army officers who got together to insure each other's vehicles because no other insurance company would insure them. 101 years later, we remain dedicated to providing for the financial security of the military community. One of the things we do here at USAA is look for opportunities to improve the lives of the military outside of the insurance and banking spaces. Our corporate responsibility team, our giving is almost exclusively focused on organizations that are tied to improving the lives of the military community, and like Blue Star Families, dedicated to researching and providing information and conducting forums like this to help advance policies that improve the military community. One thing that we're doing this year, started last year and continue to do this year, is focus on housing affordability for the military community, and also continue to work on issues like spousal employment for military spouses and addressing military and veteran suicide. But housing issues is just so core, so central to financial security, such a core pillar, that when we saw the work that Blue Star Families had done, that research, it galvanized us to elevate the housing issue as one of our priorities for our government industry relations team.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for those introductions. And John, you've given me the perfect segue because my first question will be to Jessica. And as you mentioned, your organization, Blue Star Families, recently published the results of your most recent survey of military families. So what insights can you share from your respondents' experience with housing burdens?
Yeah, thank you for that. I also want to thank John, because truly without USAA support, we wouldn't be able to do some of this research like this. And it warms my heart to hear that you take this and move it and use it to advance the efforts that you're working on, because that's why we do this work. That's why we do this research. And Shannon knows this too. We do this because we want to elevate the voices of our military and veteran families and make change and make things a little bit better. We know our families love to serve and want to be a part of this national security effort that is the military, but we need to have ways to make it a little bit easier, make it a more sustainable lifestyle. So with that, let me talk a little bit more about the findings from our 2022 Military Family Lifestyle Survey on housing and relocation. So this year, every year Military Family Lifestyle Survey does top issues. We look at what are the top issues that are most important to military families in this current year. And there are some, Shannon used the term perennial issues. There are some perennial issues that always pop up. Two of the two perennial issues are spouse employment and time away from family. We know those are key challenges of the military lifestyle, particularly spouse employment. That's been a top issue since 2009 when this survey started. So that is maybe the epitome of perennial issue. But this year, one of the things that was striking about our top issues is that 3 of the 5 were really focused on financial security. So this year we had spouse employment, time away, and then military pay, housing and relocation issues, and BAH and off-base housing. BAH off-base housing concerns was a top issue for the first time. It's the first time we've added this particular answer choice, and it immediately shot to one of the top 5 issues. And this is really key to demonstrating that military families really have financial issues and financial security at top of their mind right now. Between food inflation and food prices and housing prices, things are getting a little tighter and tighter and tighter, as they are for many American families, not limited to military families, but particularly for military families who are relocating and have to change their housing every couple of years and look for a new house that is affordable within every couple of years. They feel this acutely. One of the things that we're seeing is not only are the large majority of military families spending money out of pocket to pay for housing outside of their BAH. They get this basic allowance for housing, which is intended to cover 95% of the market rate for housing in their area. And the expected cost share for military families is you're expected to cover about 5% of your housing costs. So that for families should be between $74 a month and $168 a month in 2022. What we found is that 81% of our families who have out-of-pocket costs for housing have any out-of-pocket costs. So they are living somewhere where they're paying for housing, not necessarily in military housing where their BAH covers their housing. But in those who have any out-of-pocket costs, 81% are spending more than $200 every month on housing. And if you spread that over the course of a year or 2 years or 3 years or however long they're at that duty station, that's several $1,000s out of pocket. So that's one thing that we saw in 2022. And that actually was higher than when we looked at it last in 2021. In 2021, we had 76% were spending more than $200 a month, and now it's 81%. And in our relocation and housing pulse check that we did, we actually got an average of how much people are spending per month if they moved in the last year, and this was done in September. They moved in the last year and they were renting civilian housing, renting private housing, not in military housing, and they didn't own their house. They spent an average of $368 a month over their BAH. So not just a little bit over, well over. That's several $1,000s a year. So we know that these housing costs are pulling out of military families' budgets. We also know that, you're limited in what your choices are for housing. You as a military family can choose to live in military housing or civilian housing. Mostly, there are some circumstances in which you don't have that as much choice in that. But most military families not only live in civilian communities, but prefer to live in civilian communities. This year, and in a couple of the previous years, those choices are constrained by budgets. And we see that military families are less satisfied with their housing the more recently they moved. So they may be settling for less satisfactory housing because they're constrained by their budget. They only have so much money available for housing, and you're limited to what you can afford in that moment. So satisfaction is decreasing. We also found that families we also found that families may have been exposed to environmental toxins in housing, not necessarily in their current housing, but over at any point. So 1 in 5 actually had been reported that they had been exposed to environmental toxins in military housing at some point. That's another way that military families' choices are constrained. If you choose between civilian housing and military housing, one of the things that is concern or influence on that choice is the safety of that housing. And MFAN has talked a lot about this and reported on environmental toxins in military housing in general, and we're starting to see some of that as well. So we have choices constrained by budgets, choices constrained by safety, and despite those constrained choices, we still have to move, we still have to relocate, and we still have to find housing. And we have some choice about where we go, but not necessarily a lot of choice about where we go. So these are issues that are unique to military families in that constant, frequent relocation.
I would love to, if you don't mind, foot stomp what Jessica shared. We're seeing a lot of the same, right? And so when we looked at things like the housing cost burden, we found that 44.9% of our respondents were experiencing a severe housing cost burden, meaning that they were spending more than 50% of their total income on housing, which when you think about at the end of the day and when you're balancing your budget, if you're spending half of your resources on your home, that doesn't put a lot left for things like food, for example. The other thing that Blue Star Families, along with MFAN and several other organizations, are really looking at is that cost share piece related to the basic allowance for housing. And so several years ago, the department implemented this cost share. So looking at military families paying about 5% of the cost of their housing, and also that includes the utility component. We're really hopeful that change can happen over the course of the next year, really, to figure out how we can remove that cost share and figure out how the BAH can be restored to the full 100%, because to Jessica's point, we are seeing families go so far above what it's designed to be as far as their out-of-pocket expenses related to their housing.
If I can add a little bit back on that, thank you, Shannon, for setting that up. One of the things that we did see recently that I think is a win for military families is that we clarified that the Department of Defense has the authority to restore that back to 100% without congressional involvement. So it's moved down to 95% over the past few years, I think in 2015 or something like that. And what we're seeing is that is coming, like Shannon said, is coming well over that 5% expected cost share. We also saw that there is going to be, we need to look at how we recalculate that, not only restore it to 100%, but look at how it's calculated and how we can help it keep up with some of the skyrocketing housing costs. Because I think that's been one of the main challenges, is that housing costs and food costs and all the other costs, inflation has gone up so much that BAH in particular, but pay in general, has not been able to keep up with that.
Right. Thank you so much. Clearly, we invited the right folks because you're anticipating a lot of the questions that I had for you, which is excellent. But I do want to go just really quickly on some background and open it up to Shannon or Jessica or John. For viewers who might not be entirely familiar between the difference or of what the difference between off-base housing and on-base housing, could you quickly walk through that difference and why, if off-base housing is in fact becoming cost prohibitive and difficult to access, why is there not more of a conversation about having folks be housed on their base facilities?
Sure, I'm happy to start. So Jessica touched on this and the point that families are, in some cases, I think, adjusting how they choose where they live based on constraints that they experience. But to your point earlier, it's around 60% of military families who live out in the community and others who live on military installations. Most of the time, people have the option to choose between the two, but as Jessica mentioned, sometimes there are constraints there and people are more limited in what they can choose between. And so when you look at what the basic allowance for housing, for example, does, basic allowance for housing is people who are living out in the community, right? So they get this money within their paycheck, and it is designed to cover 95% of their housing and utility costs. When you're living on installation, which often is through a privatized agreement through MHPIs, that's the Military Housing Privatization Initiative, what that happens is that BAH goes to the housing provider, right? Mm-hmm. So the contractor who handles the upkeep, the rent, all of the components related to the military housing. And so families don't see that money. It goes directly to the housing contractor for upkeep and just the cost of maintaining the home. And so, families in a lot of cases, one thing that we saw that was interesting in our most recent research effort was that we'd never seen people choose to live on base because of the economy before. And that was something that bubbled to the top for us as top 5 this year, and what informs or what leads to people choosing where they live. And so that was really interesting and an indication that families are feeling the financial pinch of living out in the community. And so oftentimes now the living on base is the most reasonable way for them to not have to stretch their budget further to cover their housing expenses.
I want to add on to that too. I think it's like, Shannon, we were just tossing it back and forth. I love that the research that we're doing is showing some of the same things. It tells me that we are on the right track, and we are, seeing the same things from maybe slightly different perspectives and using slightly different methodologies. But that adds to the confidence that what we're talking about is a legit concern. One of the things that I wanted to add is what we saw in this year's research is similar to what Shannon is saying. We saw more people living in military housing, even when they preferred to live in civilian housing, likely because of the economic burden. We saw if you had moved in the past year, you were more likely to live in military housing than in civilian housing. And that might be because if you live in a place for longer, you decide to settle down, you want to go buy a house, something like that. But more than likely, the economy is playing into that. And I know that that has been my experience as well. I'm also an active duty enlisted Army spouse, and we relocated a couple of years ago. And when we're looking at our housing, similar to many other military families out there, when we're making housing choices, we're looking at what are the schools like? How much is it going to cost? What does the commute to work look like for the service member? Because we already spend a lot of time apart, and I don't want to spend more time apart than we absolutely have to, because, they're not going to be deployed. And we look at, the quality and the safety of the neighborhood. So when we moved, the most recent move that we did, we moved into military housing for the first time. We'd never lived in military housing prior to this in the 16 years of prior military experience, because housing costs in the community were well over what BAH would allow. And that's not even looking at utilities. That was just looking at the rent alone. So that, in combination with the schools were better on the installation, had us decide to move into military housing. That leads to another financial issue, though, and that is the financial issue of PCS homelessness. So as more people are moving in, or choosing for military housing instead of civilian housing, the wait lists for military housing get longer and longer and longer. And then those families that have PCS and have moved to their new duty station, but are still waiting for their permanent housing, they're living in temporary housing. And there is a benefit to account for those temporary lodging expenses that will pay for your family to live in a hotel for at the last year, it was 10 days. It's recently been expanded to 14 days and sometimes up to 60 days. But many families were living in housing for much longer than that period of time. They were living in temporary housing for 15 days, 20 days. We had in our pulse check last year, we had 1 in 10 of our family respondents who moved in last year were in temporary housing for 90 days. So 80 of those days came out of their pocket. They're living in hotels, for us, we were living in Airbnbs. Other people are living in RVs for months and months at a time, waiting for that permanent housing. And that comes out of pocket. So a hotel for a month is much more expensive than your permanent housing would be. So these housing issues are impacting relocation costs, which is continues to impact military families' budgets.
Thanks so much. You've clearly laid out the background here and made the case that this is a crisis. There's a real problem here for the financial security of military families across the gamut of housing issues. So going to John for a minute, you mentioned in your introduction some of the work that USIA is doing to address these issues, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what can military community serving organizations such as yours do to advance housing affordability across its multiple dimensions for military families?
Sure. Well, what a couple of things are, and again, thank you for holding this forum, because while we do have people like Shannon and Jessica who are steeped in this, living it and aware of it, there are a number of policymakers and decision makers who are not aware of this. As they were talking, there were the head nods, like, yeah, I can relate to that. But I could, throw a stone at Congress and maybe hit somebody who assumes that all currently serving members live on military housing, right? And they're taken care of and don't understand the 60% choose not to, or would prefer not to live in military housing, but prefer to be off base. So part of it's just an education piece and using forums like this to educate. And then what can we do then? I talked earlier about a focus of ours is improving the lives of the military community in a macro level, right? The listening to Jessica, I got stressed just listening to her. I'm not living this, but the idea of that, moving is bad enough, packing is bad enough, but not knowing when you can actually settle in, not knowing exactly where your kids are going to be going to school because you're not sure where you can afford to live when you're PCS. Those are additional stressors. And we talked about earlier, the housing being sort of a basic pillar of financial security. In a high inflationary environment where food is more expensive, frankly, insurance is more expensive, things are just more expensive for families, and their military salaries are not going up. Spouses are not fully employed to their high and best use in many cases. So that's another stressor. What we strive to do is identify, well, how can we, as USAA and other organizations that have this awareness and have resources, use those to elevate this conversation, right? And if you look at Congress, one of the things that we are glad to see is more, so I'm currently serving, but many veterans running for office, being elected, serving there, and then across the aisle getting together with groups like the Four Country Caucus. That's dedicated to these kinds of issues. And we get into policy. I'm a policy wonk. I got into it to make a difference, sort of more generally. People run for Congress largely because they want to get stuff done. And in the gridlocked Congress that we have and we've seen for, frankly, decades, and the partisanship gets seemingly worse every year, doing things on behalf of the military community is a cause that binds, and there are avenues to actually get things done and to the president's desk in this space. So we want to take advantage of that dynamic to say, hey, military housing, big issue, one that you can fix to the point you may not even need to act, just talk to the administration about making changes to the military housing resources that you have already, to the VA loan program to make it more usable. And that reduces the stress. So that's the role that we see USA and other groups like ours playing in this space.
Thanks so much. And you've really hit on an important point, which is, of course, what are some of the solutions to this problem? And as our name shows, like Bipartisan Policy Center is very much interested in the kinds of solutions that can bring together a wide array of decision makers. And you talked a little bit about some of the congressional outlook for potential solutions and some players in this space. So just staying on that topic, John, and also I invite the other panelists to comment on this. Do you have any additional insights as to legislation or champions or congressional spaces that are particularly helpful or that are focusing on this issue? And also, are there any developments from private industry, either the insurance or housing markets or other spaces, that you think are particularly promising for helping to lower housing costs and related costs for military families?
Well, I can briefly start and then flip it over.
Yep.
So, like I said, at the end of last year, we saw legislation move through Congress to the president's desk that on the VA loan program directed the VA to make changes to its appraisal process. They're underway. They have, I think, 90 days to develop new guidance around the appraisal process to make that easier. Again, it's not on the rental side, but the home ownership side, but to give this benefit that we provide to the military community for them to be as competitive as anybody else in that space. And that's what we want to see. Also, there have been changes made to, and I'll flip it over to Shannon and Jessica to talk about, to the basic allowance for housing and using that from last year. So continuing to work with policymakers in the administration to effectuate those changes. But I'll turn it over to Jessica because I saw her popping up as I started speaking.
Thank you so much. Yes, I want. Well, and I don't know if you could see me, but I was definitely nodding my head and agreeing with all the things that you had discussed so far. I want to start with the VA home loans because that's a great point that we want to make that more user-friendly, more usable for families. One of the things that we looked at this year, both in MFLS and in our topical pulse check, was the use of VA home loans. The VA home loan benefit is a great benefit that is available to military families, and many use it to purchase a house. But there are challenges to that as well, because there's a lot of regulations and paperwork and strings attached to using VA home loans. And many of our respondents reported that when they were looking for housing and aiming to purchase a home, using a VA home loan was a deterrent, and they were actually educated, informed, encouraged, that's the word I'm looking for, encouraged not to use their VA home loan because of those additional requirements, sellers were not, it was not as attractive to sellers. So they would lose out on homes because they could not use their VA home loan. Another thing that I wanted to highlight as a move forward in the right direction that I think it's really important to acknowledge are the recent memos from the Secretary of Defense Austin and the pay raises that we've seen for military families, military service members this year and next year. So we have seen these issues, we've highlighted them, we've elevated them, and I think it's important to highlight there are some things that are moving in the right direction that we want to celebrate, but not take our foot off the gas yet. So some of those things, Secretary of Defense Austin released a memo in September of last year. I remember because it was the day we closed this pulse check on housing issues. And we were starting to get in and analyze the data. And then Secretary of Defense Austin issues this memo that addresses the very things that we were looking at. So increasing the temporary lodging expense, increasing the BAH for certain places. So those are great steps in the right direction. We don't know yet whether they've been effective or not. He just released another memo earlier this week to address some of these issues as well. Maybe not necessarily housing issues, but some of the other financial challenges that military families face, particularly around childcare, spouse employment, because all of these things are connected, right? If spouses are employed, there's more income to pay for housing. So it's less of a struggle if you have two incomes than if you only have one. So I want to leave some for Shannon to talk about, I think maybe like BAH recalculation, but there's been a lot of good movement. So I'm going to pass it over to Shannon.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Jessica. There has been progress, and we have to take the time to appreciate and applaud that, because there are a lot of people who are working really hard to make these meaningful changes, and we know that they are not easy. And so one of the things that we talked about a little bit earlier is the BAH restoration, getting that up to the full 100% so that families are spending less out of their pocket related to their housing expenses. The other thing that we've seen in the legislation is the need to really examine how the basic allowance for housing is calculated. And so a GAO report came out about a year and a half ago now that said that there were challenges with how the BAH was essentially calculated. And in some cases, they weren't looking at enough units, for example, to really get an accurate amount for what the housing allowance should or could be. And so that's a really important piece, because it's not just about the accessibility, it's about the availability too, right? So if you don't have a house that's available that fits within the amount that you have, then, we have to think about what that could mean and how that leads to price increase. And so there absolutely are challenges. There are successes that we should definitely applaud. The BAH increase that happened this past year is huge, and that will make a difference for people. To Jessica's point, we're still waiting to see how that plays out and what some of the second and third order effects are of that, but there's work to do, and the BAH restoration is really where we and a lot of others in the space are focused, knowing that that will make an immediate impact on families' lives. And there's no attachment to any potential stigma in getting that support for families, which is a really important thing to note for the military community.
I want to add one more piece on that BAH calculation, because Shannon brings up a great point about, of the way that it is calculated and reassessing not only how quickly can it adjust to reflect the changes in the market economy, but also how military families are actually choosing their housing and what housing is available to them. One of the things that we found very important, we asked in some of our research how military families, like what are the things that are important as you're looking for housing? And they're the things that I mentioned earlier, like distant proximity to the base, and school districts and safety in the community. Also, whether they allow pets, but that's a little bit of a separate issue. But the schools are an important piece. We know military families relocate every couple of years. That means their children are changing schools every couple of years. And that's a related challenge. It's a separate challenge, but the stability of military kids' education is one of those issues that is important for families because that's how they're making their decisions about whether to stay in service, how long to stay in service, based on what the impacts are for their families. So when they're looking for housing, they're deciding on school districts, but often the good school districts that families want their kids to be in because they've been moved around a lot are those school districts that don't necessarily have the type of housing that the BAH is based on. So BAH may be based on a townhome or an apartment complex, and the good school districts don't often have townhomes or apartment complexes. They're primarily single family homes because that's the people who live in that school district. So looking at how BAH is calculated based on school districts and the way military families are actually making housing decisions, I think in addition to that restoration back up to 100% is a key piece of addressing this issue.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And you're really emphasizing that the housing question is not just about housing, it's about all these other issues, education, financial security. So going back to Shannon, you recently wrote about the impact of this financial insecurity related to housing on nutrition and food in general. So wondering if you could talk a little bit about that connection and how the current crisis might be making the situation regarding nutrition for military families quite a crisis.
Absolutely. So we've looked at food insecurity over the course of the last several years, and we recently interviewed more than 300 military families who were experiencing food insecurity to understand what are the causal factors, what are the things that are happening in their lives that bring them to the point of being food insecure. And one of those causal factors was a recent move. And so when you think about the costs that are associated with the move, and some of them are hidden, some of them are more out there for you to know about, but things like first and last month's rent, for example, or things like getting a new house furnished, or some of those expenses that are not immediately reimbursed for. So you're digging deep, you're digging into your savings, and then you hope that the expenses come through and everything is reimbursed as you expect. And so when we look at food insecurity and we look at the support that people need, what we were often hearing is that people were making decisions around paying for their rent or their mortgage or paying for food. What can you hide more easily? You can hide if you're not eating or if you're going with the less nutritious options. You can't hide if you're not paying your mortgage or paying your rent. And so as we have looked at providing support around food, we really see the connection around the housing component too. And I mentioned stigma before. There's this incredible culture of pride in the military community, and military families are really often thinking about everyone else before they're thinking about themselves. And so what we've seen a lot of is people not wanting to take advantage of certain things like food distribution events because they don't want to take away from someone else, right? And so when we've looked at things like BAH restoration, that would put more money in people's wallets so that they don't have to make those impossible choices between things like healthy groceries and their home. And when we think about this has long-term implications. This has force readiness implications. This also has real implications for the future of the all-volunteer force. We know that the future of the all-volunteer force in many cases lies in military kids. Well, if they are not eating nutritious food, or if they, don't have an experience where their family can thrive, they might be less inclined to join the family business of military service. And so these are things that are really important, and they are deep. And we're really glad that the Department of Defense is looking at it. So DoD released last summer 24% of service members who had experienced food insecurity, and that number went up to 45% when looking at the junior enlisted populations. And so we know that there are challenges here. We know that there is work that needs to be done. And we also know that these issues are so interconnected that you can't isolate one issue without needing to address the others. And the housing is a critical component of that.
Shannon, I'm so glad you raised that issue of the pride factor and the often reluctance of military personnel and their families to speak up when they're struggling. And one thing that I recall from the last survey from Blue Star Families, and just turn to Jessica to talk about this, is I didn't get a sense, and when I talked to my colleagues who served, that they at all regret their service, but would they recommend this to their children, to others, to go through it based on all of these stressors? And Jessica, I don't know, your survey picked up on that again this year.
I am so happy to jump in there. You teed it up for me so nicely. Thank you, John. Yes, so we did look at this year, and we looked both at food insecurity, like Shannon's talking about, and how that impacted your likelihood to recommend military service. So we asked 2 questions in our 2022 survey this year. One was, on a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend military service to a young family member? So it could be a daughter, a son, a cousin, a niece or a nephew. How likely are you to recommend it? With 0 being not at all likely and 10 being extremely likely. We know that there is a tradition of military service, like Shannon mentioned, and many, almost 70 to 80% of our current service members come from a family that has a tradition of military service. But as we get further and further away from conscription and from the draft, we have fewer and fewer and fewer families who have that tradition of military service since we moved to this all-volunteer force. So it's really important to capture what their experiences are and their likelihood to recommend to the next generation of all-volunteer force. So what we found is that the greatest proportion, not most, but the greatest proportion of currently serving families would recommend military service. But there's about a quarter who would not recommend military service to young family members. And one of the reasons, because we asked an open-ended question, why or why not would you recommend military service? One of the reasons was financial sacrifice. And that's an important thing to consider, because military service is economic stability. You have great benefits. You're going to continue to get paid regardless of whether there are COVID shutdowns or not. But there are still financial sacrifices attached to that. Often, I think of like spouse employment. That's a sacrifice that spouses make, is they can't maintain a career in the same way they would if they were a civilian spouse. So we looked at not only recommending service, and we know veterans were often more likely to recommend service than current service members, because there's that element of nostalgia, and it's bad when you're in it, but when you're out of it, you're like, oh, that wasn't that bad. But what we saw was that families who were food insecure were less likely to recommend service than their counterparts who were not. So if you're encountering these struggles and it's financially challenging for you to maintain military service, why would you recommend that to the next generation? So, and we saw that corroborated with some other research that was done. The 2021 survey of active duty spouses also examined food insecurity among active duty spouse population. And similar to the survey, the study that Shannon mentioned, is about a quarter of active duty spouses who reported that they had been food insecure in the past year. And that went up to 31% of enlisted active duty spouses. That's 1 in 3 that have been food insecure in the past year. And one of the things that they did in their analysis was look at the propensity to favor staying in military service. We know spouses drive a lot of the decision about whether to remain in military service or not. So, and spouses who were food insecure were 1.5 times more likely to not favor staying in military service. So they would recommend that their service member leave military service if they're they're more likely to recommend their service member leave military service if they're food insecure. So we know that these financial challenges, as evidenced by food insecurity, as evidenced by housing difficulties, can have impacts on our future all-volunteer force.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm really appreciating the back and forth between all of you. It's been a really engaging conversation. I do want to make sure we leave some time for audience questions. And going back to a point that's been made a couple times, that this housing crisis for military families is part of a broader issue of housing affordability across the country. One of our audience members makes the point, I'm hearing housing is expensive. What solutions do you propose? It's a very open-ended question, but I was wondering if perhaps we could start with John, if we could draw some of those connections between the issues that we're identifying here with housing affordability for military families and just larger trends in housing affordability. And I know you have significant exposure to housing policy in different levels, so
Sure.
we could just make that connection.
Sure. Well, this kind of cuts to how I started working in policy over 20 years ago. Was on affordable housing and working on programs like the low-income housing tax credit program and mortgage revenue bonds that provide lower, more affordable mortgages. There are market forces that drive up housing costs, and it's hard to sort of pick on one thing. But to the extent that we can leverage government resources, and frankly, taxpayer dollars for the development of affordable housing, and then allow for calculation of income and using resources like the basic allowance for housing that won't prevent the military from taking advantage of those types of housing, I think goes a long way. There's a need for more housing stock. And again, this takes me back to, sort of original principles. We don't have enough housing of very different types. Hearing Jessica talk about, you move to a new city, you're trying to find the best neighborhood for your family, a house that you can afford, and the best school system, and you realize that the type of housing that you can afford is not available there. That goes to broader questions around zoning, around building, around breaking down NIMBY arguments and pushback on greater density in some areas and changing the historic character of neighborhoods. But at the end of the day, it's the simplest, again, an economist here is it's about supply and demand, and the supply just isn't there across the country. So we just need more housing built, period.
I have to agree with you, John. You set it up perfectly. And we just need more affordable housing broadly for everybody. And it uniquely impacts military families because they move so often, they have to continue that search for housing, but everybody we need just more affordable housing in general. So I want to emphasize that this is not just a pay problem. It's not just a BAH problem. It's not just a DoD problem. It is a concern for everybody. And there's a lot of stakeholders who have a piece of the solution. So it could be that encouraging communities to build more of those, reduce bureaucratic barriers, address zoning issues, and create more of that affordable housing. It could be establishing partnerships between local landlords and local housing options and the military installation housing. So we've seen some programs that partner between local landlords and military housing in order to make sure that the housing is safe, it meets regulations, it's set for military families, but it's not part of the military housing initiative, and it's affordable, it allows pets, it's in a safe community, and so on. So there's lots of stakeholders, lots of pieces of this solution, and we need to bring a lot of different solutions to the table because it's not going to be fixed by one thing.
I agree. And I also want to applaud the partners in corporate America who are really leaning in to support this. So we're seeing a lot of organizations really invest in the area of affordable housing across the country. And that's something that absolutely fills a gap, especially while we're waiting for some of these longer lasting government changes that are needed.
Excellent. Thank you. And this is a topic we discussed a bit earlier, but I want to make sure that the takeaways are clear for our audience. With regards to concrete solutions, either legislative solutions or regulatory solutions on the part of DoD, what are some of the key points, the key policy reforms that can bolster the financial stability of military families and address this issue, and so that our audience can know like what to look for in the coming weeks and months?
Who wants to jump in first? I'll jump in first. I'm going to leave BAH to Shannon. I'm actually going to go a little bit of a different route. I think some of the solutions are incentivizing state and local governments to make it easier to build and expand the pipeline of affordable housing. Anything we can do there around zoning reforms, eliminating bureaucratic barriers, and so on. I'm also going to add that part of this issue or part of this financial concern could be solved with spouse employment. If we have two incomes, that makes the budget, it expands the budget a little bit and gives us more options around what are the housing options that are available to you. You're not limited to BAH. You might be spending over BAH, but you're not going to ruin, like you have more income to go off of. So if we can address the barriers to spouse employment, remote work being an option for spouses, that can help address some of these issues as well. But I'm going to leave the BAH and the rest to some of my partners here.
I'm probably a broken record on this, but it's for me, for MFAN, and I know Blue Star is invested in this as well. It's restoring the basic allowance for housing. And so that looks like a few different things. As Jessica mentioned, it does sit within the capability of the Department of Defense, but it also will have appropriations related implications, right? And so we're really hopeful that we can see some movement there. Again, if that money is put in military families' pockets to cover their housing expenses, it's going to help in other ways too, beyond the housing component, as we look at force readiness, as we look at food security, as we look at a variety of different things related to the economic security of the force. And then the next piece, I think we really have to learn from corporate America in some cases. There are big companies who have moved a lot of families, who have set, different salary points based on housing markets. What can we learn from some of those practices and some of those formulas and algorithms and all those things to really get BAH to a place where it can be really adaptable, right? And responsive to what the economy is looking like, because right now it is not as agile as it needs to be. And we know military families are shouldering that unfortunate reality.
Well stated, Shannon.
Thanks.
Just looking at concrete solutions, the legislation that the BPC is championing is also just really critical to see that move forward. And that a lot of the components of that legislation will address the supply issues that Jessica so perfectly articulated. And we are, again, supportive of that effort. I think there could be an opportunity in this Congress, because housing, I mentioned, supporting military families is historically and continues to be a bipartisan issue. Housing is also another bipartisan issue, and affordable housing has always been bipartisan, and that isn't changing, I think, in the near term as well. So, concrete solutions, happy to work with BPC and continue to work with you and your team on advancing that legislation.
Thank you so much, John. We're also very happy to work with you and with all the panelists here. For context, in case our audience members don't know, BPC's housing team has a legislative package called the American Housing Act, which focuses on issues of housing affordability across 3 dimensions. So it's supply, preservation of affordable housing, and ensuring appropriate demand-side supports for low-income families. You can learn much more about it on our website, so please do check it out. And then just to close out, I want to give you all the opportunity briefly to talk about, and you have a little bit already, but to give us a little bit of what this issue means personally to you, and given your lived experiences, either directly or with colleagues or people that are close to you. And we can start with Jessica.
Thank you. Obviously, as an enlisted spouse of 17 years, obviously this is an issue that impacts me in many different ways, and I've seen it play out in different ways. We've definitely been on the side of things where we relocated and we're paying a mortgage at our previous duty station and paying rent at the new duty station at the same time that I lost my job because we relocated. And so our income cut in half at the same time that our expenses doubled. And while you can plan ahead and have savings, that having double rent due every month for until you get reemployed again is expensive, and it wipes your savings out pretty quickly. So what I want to emphasize here is that it's not, when we talk about housing challenges and financial challenges, there's a lot of effort towards looking at what is the management like? What is the financial management? Where did you take a misstep? And I think you can be as prepared as you can possibly be and still run into challenges around housing and relocation for things that are outside of your control, like a wait list for military housing at the installation. That is not within your control to fix. So it has impacted me personally, and it will continue to do so. We just got orders for a new PCS, and I was sharing before this webinar started that we're moving back to an old duty station where we already bought a house, and I'm grateful because I don't have to do house hunting this time. This is the first time in several PCSs I have not had to search for a house and have that decision. And I'm grateful for it because that particular duty station has really increased the housing market has really increased over the past few years. So I appreciate all of the efforts for my partner panelists here and from the Bipartisan Policy Center to address this, because it's an issue that impacts so many military families in so many knock-on ways. Like, there are continued impacts, not only for that current duty station, but for your financial security for the future. So I will pass it back. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Shannon, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I've had some similar experiences as Jessica. We've carried, 2 mortgages longer than we wanted to because of a move. And we talked a little bit about that time when you're waiting to get into a home. That is stressful. When you're living as a family in a hotel room and trying to figure out, like, okay, what are we going to eat? How do we get groceries? We don't have like a real refrigerator, and navigating that is hard. And there are real mental health implications that are associated with that too, and the stress that comes along with this. And so, military families are going through this on average every 2.5 years. And so as we think about just what this life means, what the transience is and how that impacts people, the housing is foundational. Right. And so we have to think through, how can we make it as easy as possible? How can others out in the community just lend a hand and be supportive? I think that one of the things that happened during COVID is we all became a little bit more recluse, right? And we rely on our phones and things like that. But sometimes it's that having that conversation with people and asking how you're doing, or bringing a warm meal, things like that make a big difference. And it's that community interaction that helps people get settled. When you're moving on average every 2.5 years, feeling settled can be really difficult.
Absolutely. Okay, John, you can close us out.
Sure thing. Well, for me, I was drawn to USAA because it's a mission-driven financial services company, and that mission is to serve the military community. That's why I can speak for my colleagues, why we come and why we stay at USAA. And here's an opportunity for me personally, as a policy person, to use the skills that I have, the experience that I have, to address an issue that literally can improve the lives and well-being of the military community that's serving us every day. So that's the personal piece for me.
Thank you so much. This has been an excellent conversation. This is all the time we have, but it was a really interesting and fruitful discussion, and I'm really grateful to all our panelists for joining us, addressing the lack of affordable housing and supporting common sense solutions to ensure that military households, along with all households in this country, have access to safe, decent, and affordable homes is a key focus area for us here at the Terwilliger Center and BPC. As I mentioned at the top of the event, you can find our work on this issue on BPC's website. I believe our blog on frequently asked questions on military housing affordability was shared in the chat as well. And you are encouraged to go to our website and check out the rest of our work. And with that, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thanks so much.